In the optional content, we just described procedures and provisions that allow for an individual to be involuntarily admitted to a psychiatric facility or transported to a medical facility. Now, with all the tools that we've tried to provide you to this point in the course, we have to be realistic. At the end of the day, there is probably no greater place for an impasse between professionals than at this decision-making point. And even though we have asked you to think about how you can accurately communicate, record data, and present data, and how you can build relationships both with other professionals and with the consumer, the truth is that still, at the end of the day, there will be times when you simply do not agree with each other. We're bound to encounter people with a different understanding of their roles, responsibilities, and rules. So what do we do when we come to these impasses? We have to maintain our professionalism, both because we want to be professional for our own motivation, and as well as because we want to be effective as advocates for that consumer. But we also sometimes, flat out, need to be assertive. Is it possible to be both of these things at the same time? The answer is yes, but it does require some care. First, we must absolutely know the rules and priorities as they apply to our particular role. And it doesn't hurt to know the rules and priorities as they apply to others as well. But before we go and tell others exactly what we can and cannot do and what's expected of us, we need to make sure we're familiar with it. We certainly have reviewed that sort of material in this course, but I think it's important that we constantly refresh our memories on this. And besides, even if we have great memories, those standards and legislative provisions do change over time. So once we know the rules and priorities as they apply to us, we have to be willing to refuse to behave in a way that's contrary to our own assessment. Now, that doesn't mean we have a closed mind. If an individual tells you some information, for example, a RCMP member might be attending an emergency room with a client and have a doctor tell them something that they didn't know, well, that should allow us to think about whether or not our original assessment needs to be changed. But if that doesn't happen, then we have to be prepared to stand by our decision. So don't, for example, take an emotionally disturbed person to jail or release them to the community if you simply are not convinced it's safe to do so. And I worked one time with a professional who really taught me a valuable lesson. He was asked to come in and intervene with an individual whose behavior was very dangerous to others. I can't reveal much more than that because of confidentiality reasons. But let's put it to you this way. This individual's behavior would have been a concern to anybody who lived in the same neighborhood as them. This individual the professional was engaged to come in and do some consulting and behavioral intervention with the consumer. And to our surprise, he went from being very actively involved one day to literally resigning the next day. And when we asked him why he resigned, he told us something which shifted my view quite a lot. He said, I am not being given the resources to do this job the way I know it needs to be done. And as long as I stay here and make it seem as though I am able to do something, the proper resources will not be amassed for this individual. He said, as long as I'm a Band-Aid, people are going to think that all that's needed is a Band-Aid, when actually what's needed here is a more serious intervention. That story relates to our experience here because if we take a person and say, all right, we're going to buy them a cup of coffee and let them sober up in our company for a few hours or take them to the drunk tank and then release them, but we know that tomorrow night we're going to see that person in even worse straits than we are now, then essentially we're allowing others to believe that we've got it in our care, that we've done our full duty, when in fact, of course, we know that we haven't. And so, while it's difficult, sometimes it's better to become resolute in what we know needs to happen and be the voice of reason even when others seem to be resistant to hearing it until such time as actual care is brought aboard. And I can tell you this is very difficult because I've had to go through this myself. I hope it comes across in the way that we've talked throughout this course that I try very hard to be a diplomatic, statesmanlike, professional person who has trust in his colleagues and in other professionals. But even with all of that, there have been times when I simply could not reach a consensus with another professional. And when the client's safety was at stake, you can bet your bottom dollar I wasn't about to give in or give up. I didn't do it to be right. I didn't do it to try and prove somebody else wrong. But I was not going to sign off until I could answer the question, is this person safe? With the answer, yes. It's important for us to express our expectations and reasons for our expectations in the positive. And what we mean by that is we're not going to tell staff people what we're not willing to live with, what we're not going to do, what we're not accepting. Instead, we have to participate in solution finding, and that sometimes looks like negotiating or being creative. But we're going to try and stand in the shoes of the other person and tell them what we would like to see or a compromise that would suit us. And that gets a dialogue happening much of the time. But we also sometimes need to insist that the person begin to get help or follow up, that they don't just discharge that individual. It's not a threat, it's an insistence. And I think there's a big difference. A threat sounds like this: I'm going to get somebody else down here if you don't do it, or I'm going to report you to your board, or I'm going to report you to the College of Physicians. None of those are going to elicit a very positive response. On the other hand, if we say something like, well, I want you to know that I'm going to keep on trying, I'm not going to give up. If you want me to stop pestering you, it's going to take you doing something more than this. The threat isn't a threat, it's about me demonstrating that I'm going to remain committed. I'm not suggesting to you that the other professional will be thrilled to hear that, but it is distinctly different than making a threat, and particularly an idle threat. Ask for concrete reasons from those who disagree with you why they disagree. You're entitled to them. And in fact, other people may not be happy about it, but you're entitled to ask them to think about and be accountable for their decisions. Accountability, curiously, is one of the few values that is considered an ethic in every single profession. Now, we don't have time in this course to get into great detail about what defines a profession, but one of the things that defines a profession is that they have ethics. Ethics aren't the same in every profession across the board, but one that is accountability. And accountability is simply defined as the combination of responsibility and openness. It's not enough to say, I've got this, I'm responsible. Our ethical responsibility, no matter who's taking this course, if you're in a profession, is to not only accept responsibility, but to be able to explain why you did what you did. In the exact same way as we expect a politician to give us their receipts for every purchase, or an RCMP member to write out a report, or a doctor to write out a medical certificate. It's important that we understand that we owe that accountability to all of ourselves, every single one of the people who contributes to that system, because professions are defined as groups of people or bodies that are owned and committed to the entire community. In other words, they owe accountability to everyone. So it is our right to ask for that, and it is our right to pursue if a person seems unwilling to do it. That should be a flag to us that there's some questions about whether or not they have made the decision based on really concrete and professional evidence. Ultimately, if you're still not getting where you want to go, then it is important to consider going higher, or get somebody in your organization who's higher to do so on your behalf, or ask for the reasons or the assurances in writing. So, for example, I have said to medical professionals, can you assert that this decision would be safe for the person and the community, and ask for the individual to put it in writing. Sometimes it's enough just to ask for the clinician to give their name and to give them your name. And it's not a threat. It's simply about engendering or encouraging that accountability that we spoke of earlier. So, I'm not suggesting these are approaches that we start with. In fact, I'm clearly stating that we don't want to start with approaches that look in any way like we have a desire to have people backed up against the wall. In fact, these are paths of last resort. This is what happens if you're engaging with a person, you've assumed goodwill, you've done all of the things that you think are constructive you possibly could, and at the end of the day, you're not entirely convinced that the other person is really doing their aspects, the aspects of their job that you expect from them. So we have to be prepared sometimes to stand up for ethics. And ethics are not an easy thing to do. They're not an easy thing to stand up for. But we have to do it when it matters most. And when it matters most is usually when it's toughest.